The Light Fantastic by Terry Pratchett, read by Nigel Planer. The sun rose slowly, as if it wasn't sure it was worth all the effort. Another disk day dawned, but very gradually, and this is why. When light encounters a strong magical field, it loses all sense of urgency. It slows right down. And on the Discworld, the magic was embarrassingly strong, which meant that the soft yellow light of dawn flowed over the sleeping landscape like the caress of a gentle lover, or, as some would have it, like golden syrup. It paused to fill up valleys. It piled up against mountain ranges. When it reached Cori Celesti, the 10-mile spire of grey stone and green ice that marked the hub of the disk and was the home of its gods, it built up in heaps until it finally crashed in great lazy tsunami, as silent as velvet, across the dark landscape beyond. It was a sight to be seen on no other world. Of course, no other world was carried through the starry infinity on the backs of 4 giant elephants, who were themselves perched on the shell of a giant turtle. His name, or her name, according to another school of thought, was Great Artuin. He, or as it might be, she, will not take a central role in what follows, but it is vital to an understanding of the disk that he or she is there, down below the mines and sea ooze and fake fossil bones put there by a creator with nothing better to do than upset archaeologists and give them silly ideas. Great Artuin, the star turtle, shell-frosted with frozen methane, pitted with meteor craters, and scoured with asteroidal dust. Great Artuin, with eyes like ancient seas and a brain the size of a continent through which thoughts moved like little glittering glaciers. Great Artuin of the great slow sad flippers and star-polished carapace, labouring through the galactic night under the weight of the disk. As large as worlds, as old as time, as patient as a brick. Actually, the philosophers have got it all wrong. Great Artuin is in fact having a great time. Great Artuin is the only creature in the entire universe that knows exactly where it is going. Of course, philosophers have debated for years about where Great Artuin might be going, and have often said how worried they are that they might never find out. They're due to find out in about 2 months, and then they're really going to worry. Something else that has long worried the more imaginative philosophers on the disk is the question of Great Artuin's sex, and quite a lot of time and trouble has been spent in trying to establish it once and for all. In fact, as the great dark shape drifts past like an endless tortoise-shell hairbrush, the results of the latest effort are just coming into view. Tumbling past, totally out of control, is the bronze shell of the potent Voyager, a sort of Neolithic spaceship built and pushed over the edge by the astronomer-priests of Krull, which is conveniently situated on the very rim of the world, and proves, whatever people say, that there is such a thing as a free launch. Inside the ship is Two-Flower, the disk's first tourist. He had recently spent some months exploring it, and is now rapidly leaving it for reasons that are rather complicated but have to do with an attempt to escape from Krull. This attempt has been 1000% successful. But despite all the evidence that he may be the disk's last tourist as well, he is enjoying the view. Plunging along some 2 miles above him is Rincewind the Wizard, in what on the disk passes for a spacesuit. Picture it as a diving suit designed by men who have never seen the sea. 6 months ago he was a perfectly ordinary failed wizard. Then he met Two-Flower, was employed at an outrageous salary as his guide, and has spent most of the intervening time being shot at, terrorized, chased, and hanging from high places with no hope of salvation, or, as is now the case, dropping from high places. He isn't looking at the view because his past life keeps flashing in front of his eyes and getting in the way. He's learning why it is that when you put on a spacesuit, it's vitally important not to forget the helmet. A lot more could be included now to explain why these two are dropping out of the world, and why Two Flowers' luggage, last seen desperately trying to follow him on hundreds of little legs, is no ordinary suitcase, but such questions take time, and could be more trouble than they are worth. For example, it is said that someone at a party once asked the famous philosopher Li Tin Weedle, "Why are you here?" And the reply took 3 years. What is far more important is an event happening way overhead, far above Artuin, the elephants, and the rapidly expiring wizard. The very fabric of time and space is about to be put through the wringer. The air was greasy with the distinctive feel of magic, and acrid with the smoke of candles made of a black wax whose precise origin a wise man wouldn't inquire about. There was something very strange about this room deep in the cellars of Unseen University, the Disc's premier college of magic. For one thing, it seemed to have too many dimensions, not exactly visible, just hovering out of eyeshot. The walls were covered with occult symbols, and most of the floor was taken up by the eightfold seal of stasis, generally agreed in magical circles to have all the stopping power of a well-aimed half-brick. The only furnishing in the room was a lectern of dark wood, carved into the shape of a bird. Well, to be frank, into the shape of a winged thing it is probably best not to examine too closely. And on the lectern, fastened to it by a heavy chain covered in padlocks, was a book. A large, but not particularly impressive book. Other books in the university's libraries had covers inlaid with rare jewels and fascinating wood, or bound with dragon skin. This one was just a rather tatty leather. It looked the sort of book described in library catalogues as slightly foxed, although it would be more honest to admit that it looked as though it had been badgered, wolved, and possibly bared as well. Metal clasps held it shut. They weren't decorated, they were just very heavy, like the chain, which didn't so much attach the book to the lectern as tether it. They looked like the work of someone who had a pretty definite aim in mind, and who had spent most of his life making training harnesses for elephants. The air thickened and swirled. The pages of the book began to crinkle in a quite horrible, deliberate way, and a blue light spilled out from between them. The silence of the room crowded in like a fist, slowly being clenched. Half a dozen wizards in their nightshirts were taking turns to peer in through the little grill in the door. No wizard could sleep with this sort of thing going on. The build-up of raw magic was rising through the university like a tide. "Right," said a voice. "What's going on, and why wasn't I summoned?" Golda Weatherwax, Supreme Grand Conjurer of the Order of the Silver Star, Lord Imperial of the Sacred Staff, 8th Level Ipsissimus, and 304th Chancellor of Unseen University, wasn't simply an impressive sight, even in his red nightshirt with the hand-embroidered mystic runes, even in his long cap with the bobble on, even with the wee willy-winky candlestick in his hand. He even managed to very nearly pull it off in fluffy pom-pom slippers as well. 6 frightened faces turned towards him. You were summoned, Lord," said one of the under-wizards. "That's why you're here," he added helpfully. "I mean, why wasn't I summoned before?" snapped Golda, pushing his way to the grill. Before who, Lord?" said the wizard. Golda glared at him and ventured a quick glance through the grill. The air in the room was now sparkling with tiny flashes, as dust motes incinerated in the flow of raw magic. The seal of stasis was beginning to blister and curl up at the edges. The book in question was called The Octavo, and quite obviously it was no ordinary book. There are, of course, many famous books of magic. Some may talk of the Necrotelecomnicon, with its pages made of ancient lizard skin. Some may point to the book of Going Forth Around 11ish, written by a mysterious and rather lazy Lamaic sect. Some may recall that the Bumper Fun grimoire reputedly contains the one original joke left in the universe, but they are all mere pamphlets when compared with the Octavo, which the creator of the universe reputedly left behind, with characteristic absent-mindedness, shortly after completing his major work. The 8 spells imprisoned in its pages led a secret and complex life of their own, and it was generally believed that Golder's brow furrowed as he stared into the troubled room. Of course, there were only 7 spells now. Some young idiot of a student wizard had stolen a look at the book one day, and one of the spells had escaped and lodged in his mind. No one had ever managed to get to the bottom of how it had happened. What was his name now? Winswand? Octarine and purple sparks glittered on the spine of the book. A thin curl of smoke was beginning to rise from the lectern, and the heavy metal clasps that held the book shut were definitely beginning to look strained. "Why are the spells so restless?" said one of the younger wizards. Golder shrugged. He couldn't show it, of course, but he was beginning to be really worried. As a skilled 8th-level wizard, he could see the half-imaginary shapes that appeared momentarily in the vibrating air, wheedling and beckoning. In much the same way that gnats appear before a thunderstorm, really heavy build-ups of magic always attracted things from the chaotic dungeon dimensions. Nasty things, all misplaced organs and spittle, forever searching for any gap through which they might sidle into the world of men. They won't be described, since even the pretty ones looked like the offspring of an octopus and a bicycle. It is well known that things from undesirable universes are always seeking an entrance into this one, which is the psychic equivalent of handy for the buses and closer to the shops. This had to be stopped. "I shall need a volunteer," he said firmly. There was a sudden silence. The only sound came from behind the door. It was the nasty little noise of metal parting under stress. "Very well, then," he said. "In that case I shall need some silver tweezers, about 2 pints of cat's blood, a small whip, and a chair." It is said that the opposite of noise is silence. This isn't true. Silence is only the absence of noise. Silence would have been a terrible din compared to the sudden, soft implosion of noiselessness that hit the wizards with the force of an exploding dandelion clock. A thick column of spitting light sprang up from the book, hit the ceiling in a splash of flame, and disappeared. Golder stared up at the hole, ignoring the smouldering patches in his beard. He pointed dramatically. "To the upper cellars!" he cried, and bounded up the stone stairs. Slippers flapping and nightshirts billowing, the other wizards followed him, falling over one another in their eagerness to be last. Nevertheless, they were all in time to see the fireball of occult potentiality disappear into the ceiling of the room above. "Ugh!" said the youngest wizard, and pointed to the floor. The room had been part of the library until the magic had drifted through, violently reassembling the possibility particles of everything in its path. So it was reasonable to assume that the small purple newts had been part of the floor, and the pineapple custard may once have been some books. And several of the wizards later swore that the small, sad orangutan sitting in the middle of it all looked very much like the head librarian. Golder stared upwards. "To the kitchen!" he bellowed, wading through the custard to the next flight of stairs. No one ever found out what the great cast-iron cooking range had been turned into, because it had broken down a wall and made good its escape before the dishevelled party of wild-eyed mages burst into the room. The vegetable chef was found much later, hiding in the soup cauldron, gibbering unhelpful things like, "The knuckles! The horrible knuckles!" The last wisps of magic, now somewhat slowed, were disappearing into the ceiling. "To the great hall!" The stairs were much wider here, and better lit. Panting and pineapple-flavoured, the fitter wizards got to the top by the time the fireball had reached the middle of the huge, draughty chamber that was the university's main hall. It hung motionless, except for the occasional small prominence that arched and spluttered across its surface. Wizards smoke, as everyone knows. That probably explained the chorus of coffin coughs and saw-tooth wheezes that erupted behind Golder as he stood appraising the situation and wondering if he dare look for somewhere to hide. He grabbed a frightened student. "Get me seers, farseers, scryers, and within-looking men," he barked. "I want this studied." Something was taking shape inside the fireball. Golder shielded his eyes and peered at the shape forming in front of him. There was no mistaking it. It was the universe. He was quite sure of this because he had a model of it in his study, and it was generally agreed to be far more impressive than the real thing. Faced with the possibilities offered by seed pearls and silver filigree, the creator had been at a complete loss. But the tiny universe inside the fireball was uncannily, well, real. The only thing missing was colour. It was all in translucent, misty white. There was Great Artuin, and the 4 elephants, and the disc itself. From this angle, Golder couldn't see the surface very well, but he knew with cold certainty that it would be absolutely accurately modelled. He could, though, just make out a miniature replica of Cori Celesti, upon whose utter peak the world's quarrelsome and somewhat bourgeois gods lived, in a palace of marble, alabaster, and uncut moquette 3-piece suites they had chosen to call Dun Manifestin. It was always a considerable annoyance to any disc citizen with pretensions to culture that they were ruled by gods whose idea of an uplifting artistic experience was a musical doorbell. The little embryo universe began to move slowly, tilting. Golder tried to shout, but his voice refused to come out. Gently, but with the unstoppable force of an explosion, the shape expanded. He watched in horror, and then in astonishment, as it passed through him as lightly as a thought. He held out a hand, and watched the pale ghosts of rock strata stream through his fingers in busy silence. Great Artuin had already sunk peacefully below floor level, larger than a house. The wizards behind Golder were waist-deep in seas. A boat smaller than a thimble caught Golder's eye for a moment before the rush carried it through the walls and away. "To the roof!" he managed, pointing a shaking finger skywards. Those wizards with enough marbles left to think with, and enough breath to run, followed him, running through continents that sleeted smoothly through the solid stone. It was a still night, tinted with the promise of dawn. A crescent moon was just setting. Ankh-Morpork, largest city in the lands around the Circle Sea, slept. That statement is not really true. On the one hand, those parts of the city which normally concern themselves with, for example, selling vegetables, shoeing horses, carving exquisite small jade ornaments, changing money, and making tables, on the whole, slept, unless they had insomnia, or had got up in the night, as it might be, to go to the lavatory. On the other hand, many of the less law-abiding citizens were wide awake, and, for instance, climbing through windows that didn't belong to them, slitting throats, mugging one another, listening to loud music in smoky cellars, and generally having a lot more fun. But most of the animals were asleep, except for the rats. And the bats too, of course. And as far as the insects were concerned. The point is that descriptive writing is very rarely entirely accurate, and during the reign of Olaf Quimby II, as patrician of Ankh, some legislation was passed in a determined attempt to put a stop to this sort of thing and introduce some honesty into reporting. Thus, if a legend said of a notable hero that all men spoke of his prowess, any bard who valued his life would add hastily, except for a couple of people in his home village who thought he was a liar, and quite a lot of other people who had never really heard of him. Poetic simile was strictly limited to statements like, "His mighty steed was as fleet as the wind on a fairly calm day, say about force 3. And any loose talk about a beloved having a face that launched 1,000 ships would have to be backed by evidence that the object of desire did indeed look like a bottle of champagne. Quimby was eventually killed by a disgruntled poet during an experiment conducted in the palace grounds to prove the disputed accuracy of the proverb, "The pen is mightier than the sword," and in his memory it was amended to include the phrase, "only if the sword is very small and the pen is very sharp." So, approximately 67, maybe 68% of the city slept. Not that the other citizens, creeping about on their generally unlawful occasions, noticed the pale tide streaming through the streets. Only the wizards, used to seeing the invisible, watched it foam across the distant fields. The disk, being flat, has no real horizon. Any adventurous sailors who got funny ideas from staring at eggs and oranges for too long and set out for the Antipodes soon learned that the reason why distant ships sometimes looked as though they were disappearing over the edge of the world was that they were disappearing over the edge of the world. But there was still a limit even to Golder's vision in the mist-swirled, dust-filled air. He looked up. Looming high over the university was the grim and ancient Tower of Art, said to be the oldest building on the disk, with its famous spiral staircase of 8,888 steps. From its crenellated roof, the haunt of ravens and disconcertingly alert gargoyles, a wizard might see to the very edge of the disk. After spending 10 minutes or so coughing, horribly, of course. "Sod that," he muttered. "What's the good of being a wizard after all? Aviento Thessalus. I would fly. To me, spirits of air and darkness." He spread a gnarled hand and pointed to a piece of crumbling parapet. Octarine fire sprouted from under his nicotine-stained nails and burst against the rotting stone far above. It fell. By a finely calculated exchange of velocities, Golder rose, nightshirt flapping around his bony legs. Higher and higher he soared, hurtling through the pale light, like an elderly but powerful wizard being propelled upwards by an expertly judged thumb on the scales of the universe. He landed in a litter of old nests, caught his balance, and stared down at the vertiginous view of a disk dawn. At this time of the long year, the Circle Sea was almost on the sunset side of Cori Celesti, and as the daylight sloshed down into the lands around Ankh-Morpork, the shadow of the mountains scythed across the landscape like the gnomon of God's sundial. But, nightwards, racing the slow light towards the edge of the world, a line of white mist surged on. There was a crackling of dry twigs behind him. He turned to see Umpe Truman, second in command of the order, who had been the only other wizard able to keep up. Golder ignored him for a moment, taking care only to keep a firm grip of the stonework and strengthen his personal spells of protection. Promotion was slow in a profession that traditionally bestowed long life, and it was accepted that younger wizards would frequently seek advancement via dead men's curly shoes, having previously emptied them of their occupants. Besides, there was something disquieting about young Truman. He didn't smoke, only drank boiled water, and Golder had the nasty suspicion that he was clever. He didn't smile often enough, and he liked figures and the sort of organization charts that show lots of squares with arrows pointing to other squares. In short, he was the sort of man who could use the word personnel and mean it. The whole of the visible disk was now covered with a shimmering white skin that fitted it perfectly. Golder looked down at his own hands and saw them covered with a pale network of shining threads that followed every movement. He recognized this kind of spell. He'd used them himself, but his had been smaller, much smaller. "It's a change spell," said Truman. "The whole world is being changed." Some people thought Golder grimly would have had the decency to put an exclamation mark on the end of a statement like that. There was the faintest of pure sounds, high and sharp, like the breaking of a mouse's heart. "What was that?" he said. Truman cocked his head. C-sharp, I think," he said. Golder said nothing. The white shimmer had vanished, and the first sounds of the waking city began to filter up to the two wizards. Everything seemed exactly the same as it had before. All that, just to make things stay the same? He patted his nightshirt pockets distractedly and finally found what he was looking for, lodged behind his ear. He put the soggy dog end in his mouth, called up mystical fire from between his fingers, and dragged hard on the wretched roll-up until little blue lights flashed in front of his eyes. He coughed once or twice. He was thinking very hard indeed. He was trying to remember if any gods owed him any favours. In fact, the gods were as puzzled by all this as the wizards were, but they were powerless to do anything, and in any case were engaged in an eons-old battle with ice giants, who had refused to return the lawn-mower. But some clue as to what actually had happened might be found in the fact that Rincewind, whose past life had just got up to a quite interesting bit when he was 15, suddenly found himself not dying after all, but hanging upside down in a pine tree. He got down easily by dropping uncontrollably from branch to branch until he landed on his head in a pile of pine needles, where he lay gasping for breath and wishing he'd been a better person. Somewhere, he knew, there had to be a perfectly logical connection. 1 minute one happens to be dying, having dropped off the rim of the world, and the next one is upside down in a tree. As always happened at times like this, the spell rose up in his mind. Rincewind had been generally reckoned by his tutors to be a natural wizard in the same way that fish are natural mountaineers. He probably would have been thrown out of Unseen University anyway. He couldn't remember spells, and smoking made him feel ill. But what had really caused trouble was all that stupid business about sneaking into the room where the octavo was chained and opening it. And what made the trouble even worse was that no one could figure out why all the locks had temporarily become unlocked. The spell wasn't a demanding lodger. It just sat there like an old toad at the bottom of a pond. But whenever Rincewind was feeling really tired or very afraid, it tried to get itself said. No one knew what would happen if one of the 8 great spells was said by itself, but the general agreement was that the best place from which to watch the effects would be the next universe. It was a weird thought to have, lying on a heap of pine needles just after falling off the edge of the world, but Rincewind had a feeling that the spell wanted to keep him alive. "Suits me," he thought. He sat up and looked at the trees. Rincewind was a city wizard, and although he was aware that there were various differences among types of tree by which their nearest and dearest could tell them apart, the only thing he knew for certain was that the end without the leaves on fitted into the ground. There were far too many of them, arranged with absolutely no sense of order. The place hadn't been swept for ages. He remembered something about being able to tell where you were by looking at which side of a tree the moss grows on. These trees had moss everywhere, and wooden warts, and scrabbly old branches. If trees were people, these trees would be sitting in rocking chairs. Rincewind gave the nearest one a kick. With unerring aim, it dropped an acorn on him. He said, "Ow." The tree, in a voice like a very old door swinging open, said, "Serves you right." There was a long silence. Then Rincewind said, "Did you say that?" "Yes." "And that too?" "Yes." "Oh." He thought for a bit. Then he tried, "I suppose you wouldn't happen to know the way out of the forest, possibly, by any chance?" "No, I don't get about much," said the tree. "Fairly boring life, I imagine," said Rincewind. "I wouldn't know. I've never been anything else," said the tree. Rincewind looked at it closely. It seemed pretty much like every other tree he'd seen. "Are you magical?" he said. "No one's ever said," said the tree. "I suppose so." Rincewind thought. "I can't be talking to a tree. If I was talking to a tree, I'd be mad, and I'm not mad, so trees can't talk." "Goodbye," he said firmly. "Hey, don't go," the tree began, and then realized the hopelessness of it all. It watched him stagger off through the bushes and settle down to feeling the sun on its leaves, the slurp and gurgle of the water in its roots, and the very ebb and flow of its sap in response to the natural tug of the sun and moon. Boring, it thought. What a strange thing to say. Trees can be bored, of course. Beetles do it all the time, but I don't think that was what he was trying to mean. And can you actually be anything else? In fact, Rincewind never spoke to this particular tree again, but from that brief conversation it spun the basis of the first tree religion, which in time swept the forests of the world. Its tenet of faith was this: a tree that was a good tree and led a clean, decent, and upstanding life could be assured of a future life after death. If it was very good indeed, it would eventually be reincarnated as 5,000 rolls of lavatory paper. A few miles away, Two-Flower was also getting over his surprise at finding himself back on the disk. He was sitting on the hull of the potent Voyager as it gurgled gradually under the dark waters of a large lake, surrounded by trees. Strangely enough, he was not particularly worried. Two-Flower was a tourist, the first of the species to evolve on the disk, and fundamental to his very existence was the rock-hard belief that nothing bad could really happen to him because he was not involved. He also believed that anyone could understand anything he said, provided he spoke loudly and slowly, that people were basically trustworthy, and that anything could be sorted out among men of goodwill if they just acted sensibly. On the face of it, this gave him a survival value marginally less than, say, a soap herring, but to Rincewynd's amazement, it all seemed to work, and the little man's total obliviousness to all forms of danger somehow made danger so discouraged that it gave up and went away. Merely being faced with drowning stood no chance. Two-Flower was quite certain that in a well-organised society people would not be allowed to go around getting drowned. He was a little bothered, though, about where his luggage had got to, but he comforted himself with the knowledge that it was made of sapient pearwood and ought to be intelligent enough to look after itself. In yet another part of the forest, a young shaman was undergoing a very essential part of his training. He had eaten of the sacred toadstool, he had smoked the holy rhizome, and had carefully powdered up and inserted into various orifices the mystic mushroom, and now, sitting cross-legged under a pine tree, he was concentrating firstly on making contact with the strange and wonderful secrets at the heart of being, but mainly on stopping the top of his head from unscrewing and floating away. Blue four-side triangles pinwheeled across his vision. Occasionally he smiled knowingly at nothing very much and said things like, "Wow," and There was a movement in the air, and what he later described as, "like a sort of explosion, only backwards, you know." And suddenly, where there had only been nothing, there was a large battered wooden chest. It landed heavily on the leaf mould, extended dozens of little legs, and turned round ponderously to look at the shaman. That is to say, it had no face, but even through the mycological haze he was horribly aware that it was looking at him. And not a nice look either. It was amazing how baleful a keyhole and a couple of knotholes could be. To his intense relief, it gave a sort of wooden shrug and set off through the trees at a canter. With superhuman effort, the shaman recalled the correct sequence of movements for standing up, and even managed a couple of steps before he looked down and gave up, having run out of legs. Rincewind, meanwhile, had found a path. It wound about a good deal, and he would have been happier if it had been cobbled, but following it gave him something to do. Several trees tried to strike up a conversation, but Rincewind was nearly certain that this was not normal behaviour for trees, and ignored them. The day lengthened. There was no sound but the murmur of nasty little stinging insects, the occasional crack of a falling branch, and the whispering of the trees discussing religion and the trouble with squirrels. Rincewind began to feel very lonely. He imagined himself living in the woods forever, sleeping on leaves and eating whatever there was to eat in the woods. Trees, he supposed, and nuts and berries. He would have to— Rincewind! There, coming up the path, was Two-Flower, dripping wet but beaming with delight. The luggage trotted along behind him. Anything made of the wood would follow its owner anywhere, and it was often used to make luggage for the grave goods of very rich dead kings who wanted to be sure of starting a new life in the next world with clean underwear. Rincewind sighed. Up to now, he'd thought the day couldn't possibly get worse. It began to rain, a particularly wet and cold rain. Rincewind and Two-Flower sat under a tree and watched it. "Rincewind? Why are we here?" "Well, some say that the creator of the universe made the disk and everything on it. Others say that it's all a very complicated story involving the testicles of the sky god and the milk of the celestial cow, and some even hold that we're all just due to the total random accretion of probability particles. But if you mean why are we here, as opposed to falling off the disk, I haven't the faintest idea. It's probably all some ghastly mistake." "Oh, do you think there's anything to eat in this forest?" "Yes," said the wizard bitterly. "Us." "I've got some acorns, if you like," said the tree helpfully. They sat in damp silence for some moments. "Rincewind, the tree said—" "Trees can't talk," snapped Rincewind. "It's very important to remember that." "But you just heard." Rincewind sighed. "Look," he said, "it's all down to simple biology, isn't it? If you're going to talk, you need the right equipment, like lungs and lips notes and, vocal cords, said the tree. Yeah, them, said Rincewind. He shut up and stared gloomily at the rain. I thought wizards knew all about trees and wild food and things, said Two-Flower reproachfully. It was very seldom that anything in his voice suggested that he thought of Rincewind as anything other than a magnificent enchanter, and the wizard was stung into action. I do, he snapped. Well, what kind of tree is this? Said the tourist. Rincewind looked up. Beech, he said firmly. Actually, began the tree, and shut up quickly. It had caught Rincewind's look. Those things up there look like acorns, said Two-Flower. Yes, well, this is the sessile or heptocarpic variety, said Rincewind. The nuts look very much like acorns. In fact, they can fool practically anybody. Gosh, said Two-Flower, and what's that bush over there? Mistletoe. But it's got thorns and red berries. Well, said Rincewind sternly, and stared hard at him. Two-Flower broke first. Nothing, he said meekly. I must have been misinformed. Right. But there's some big mushrooms under it. Can you eat them? Rincewind looked at them cautiously. They were indeed very big, and had red and white spotted caps. They were in fact a variety that the local shaman, who at this point was some miles away making friends with a rock, would only eat after first attaching one leg to a large stone with a rope. There was nothing for it but to go out in the rain and look at them. He knelt down in the leaf mould and peered under the cap. After a while he said weakly, No good to eat at all. Why? Called Two-Flower. Are the gills the wrong shade of yellow? No, not really. I expect the stems haven't got the right kind of fluting, then. They look okay, actually. The cap, then. I expect the cap is the wrong colour, said Two-Flower. Not sure about that. Well, then, why can't you eat them? Rincewind coughed. It's the little doors and windows, he said wretchedly. It's a dead giveaway. Thunder rolled across the unseen university. Rain poured over its roofs and gurgled out of its gargoyles, although one or two of the more cunning ones had scuttled off to shelter among the maze of tiles. Far below, in the great hall, the 8 most powerful wizards on the Discworld gathered at the angles of a ceremonial octagram. Actually, they probably weren't the most powerful, if truth were known, but they certainly had great powers of survival, which in the highly competitive world of magic was pretty much the same thing. Behind every wizard of the 8th rank were half a dozen 7th rank wizards trying to bump him off, and senior wizards had to develop an inquiring attitude to, for example, scorpions in their bed. An ancient proverb summed it up. When a wizard is tired of looking for broken glass in his dinner, it ran, he is tired of life. The oldest wizard, grey-hulled Spold of the ancient and truly original sages of the Unbroken Circle, leaned heavily on his carven staff and spake thusly. Get on with it, Weatherwax! My feet are giving me jip! Golder, who had merely paused for effect, glared at him. Very well, then, I will be brief. Jolly good. We all sought guidance as to the events of this morning. Can anyone among us say he received it? The wizards looked sidelong at one another. Nowhere outside a trades union conference fraternal benefit night can so much mutual distrust and suspicion be found as among a gathering of senior enchanters. But the plain fact was that the day had gone very badly. Normally, informative demons, summoned abruptly from the dungeon dimensions, had looked sheepish and sidled away when questioned. Magic mirrors had cracked. Tarot cards had mysteriously become blank. Crystal balls had gone all cloudy. Even tea leaves, normally scorned by wizards as frivolous and unworthy of contemplation, had clustered together at the bottom of cups and refused to move. In short, the assembled wizards were at a loss. There was a general murmur of agreement. And therefore I propose we perform the rite of Ankh-Morpork, said Golder dramatically. He had to admit that he had hoped for a better response, something along the lines of, well, no, not the rite of Ankh-Morpork. Man was not meant to meddle with such things. In fact, there was a general mutter of approval. Good idea. Seems reasonable. Well, get on with it, then. Slightly put out, he summoned a procession of lesser wizards who carried various magical implements into the hall. It has already been hinted that around this time there was some disagreement among the fraternity of wizards about how to practice magic. Younger wizards in particular went about saying that it was time that magic started to update its image, and that they should all stop mucking about with bits of wax and bone, and put the whole thing on a properly organised basis, with research programmes and 3-day conventions in good hotels where they could read papers with titles like Wither Geomancy and The Role of 7-League Boots in a Caring Society. Trumon, for example, hardly ever did any magic these days, but ran the order with hourglass efficiency, and wrote lots of memos, and had a big chart on his office wall, covered with coloured blobs and flags and lines that no one else really understood, but which looked very impressive. The other type of wizard thought all this was so much marsh gas, and wouldn't have anything to do with an image, unless it was made of wax and had pins stuck in it. The heads of the 8 orders were all of this persuasion, traditionalists to a mage, and the utensils that were heaped around the octagram had a definite no-nonsense occult look about them. Ram's horns, skulls, baroque metalwork, and heavy candles were much in evidence, despite the discovery by younger wizards that the rite of Ushk Ente could perfectly well be performed with 3 small bits of wood and 4 cubic centimetres of mouse blood. The preparations normally took several hours, but the combined powers of the senior wizards shortened it considerably, and after a mere 40 minutes Golda chanted the final words of the spell. They hung in front of him for a moment before dissolving. The air in the centre of the octagram shimmered and thickened, and suddenly contained a tall, dark figure. Most of it was hidden by a black robe and hood, and this was probably just as well. It had a long scythe in one hand, and one couldn't help noticing that what should have been fingers was simply white bone. The other skeletal hand held small cubes of cheese and pineapple on a stick.
"Well?"
said Death, in a voice with all the warmth and colour of an iceberg. He caught the wizard's gaze and glanced down at the stick.
"I was at a party,"
he added, a shade reproachfully. "O creature of earth and darkness, we do charge thee to abjure from—" began Golda in a firm, commanding voice. Death nodded.
Yes, I know all that. Why have you summoned me?"
"It is said that you can see both the past and the future," said Golda, a little sulkily, because the big speech of binding and conjuration was one he rather liked, and people said he was very good at it.
"That is absolutely correct."
"Then perhaps you can tell us what exactly it was that happened this morning," said Golda. He pulled himself together and added loudly, "I command this by Azim Rother, by Tchikel, by—"
"All right, you've made your point. What precisely was it you wished to know? Quite a lot of things happened this morning. People were born, people died, all the trees grew a bit taller, ripples made an interesting pattern on the sea."
"I mean about the octavo," said Golda coldly.
"That? Oh, that was just a readjustment of reality. I understand the octavo was anxious not to lose the 8th spell. It was dropping off the disc, apparently."
Hold on, said Golda. He scratched his chin. "Are we talking about the one inside the head of Rincewind? Tall, thin man? Bit scraggy? The one—"
"That he has been carrying around all these years, yes."
Golda frowned. It seemed a lot of trouble to go to. Everyone knew that when a wizard died all the spells in his head would go free, so why bother to save Rincewind? The spell would just float back eventually. "Any idea why?" he said, without thinking, and then remembering himself in time, added hastily, "By Irip and Kcharla, I do abjure thee, and—"
"I wish you wouldn't keep doing that. All that I know is that all the spells have to be said together next Hogswatch night, or the disc will be destroyed."
"Speak up there," demanded Greyhound Spold. "Shut up," said Golder.
Me?
"No, him, daft old—" "I heard that," snapped Spold. "You young people—" He stopped. Death was looking at him thoughtfully, as if he was trying to remember his face. "Look," said Golder. "Just repeat that bit again, will you? The disc will be what?"
"Destroyed. Can I go now? I left my drink."
"Hang on," said Golder hurriedly. "By Celliliki and Orizzoni and so forth. What do you mean, destroyed?"
"It's an ancient prophecy written on the inner walls of the Great Pyramid of Tsort. The word destroyed seems quite self-explanatory to me."
"That's all you can tell us?"
"Yes."
"But Hogswatch Night is only 2 months away."
"Yes."
"At least you can tell us where Rincewind is now." Death shrugged. It was a gesture he was particularly well built for.
"The forests of Skund, rimwards of the Ramtop Mountains."
"What is he doing there?"
"Feeling very sorry for himself."
"Oh."
"Now may I go?"
Golder nodded distractedly. He had been thinking wistfully of the banishment ritual which started "Begone, foul shade," and had some rather impressive passages which he had been practicing, but somehow he couldn't work up any enthusiasm. "Oh, yes," he said. "Thank you, yes." And then, because it's as well not to make enemies even among the creatures of the night, he added politely, "I hope it is a good party." Death didn't answer. He was looking at Spold in the same way that a dog looks at a bone, only in this case things were more or less the other way round. "I said I hope it is a good party," said Golder loudly.
"At the moment it is. I think it might go downhill very quickly at midnight."
"Why?"
"That's when they think I'll be taking my mask off."
He vanished, leaving only a cocktail stick and a short paper streamer behind. There had been an unseen observer of all this. It was of course entirely against the rules, but Trumon knew all about rules, and had always considered they were for making, not obeying. Long before the 8 mages had got down to some serious arguing about what the apparition had meant, he was down in the main levels of the university library. It was an awe-inspiring place. Many of the books were magical, and the important thing to remember about grimoires is that they are deadly in the hands of any librarian who cares about order, because he's bound to stick them all on the same shelf. This is not a good idea with books that tend to leak magic, because more than 1 or 2 of them together form a critical black mass. On top of that, many of the lesser spells are quite particular about the company they keep, and tend to express any objections by hurling their books viciously across the room. And of course there is always the half-felt presence of the things from the dungeon dimensions, clustering around the magical leakage and constantly probing the walls of reality. The job of magical librarian, who has to spend his working days in this sort of highly charged atmosphere, is a high-risk occupation. The head librarian was sitting on top of his desk, quietly peeling an orange, and was well aware of that. He glanced up when Trumon entered. "I'm looking for anything we've got on the Pyramid of Chut," said Trumon. He'd come prepared. He took a banana out of his pocket. The librarian looked at it mournfully, and then flopped down heavily on the floor. Trumon found a soft hand poked gently into his, and the librarian led the way, waddling sadly between the bookshelves. It was like holding a little leather glove. Around them the books sizzled and sparked, with the occasional discharge of undirected magic flashing over to the carefully placed earthing rods nailed on the shelves. There was a tinny blue smell, and just at the very limit of hearing the horrible chittering of the dungeon creatures. Like many other parts of Unseen University, the library occupied rather more space than its outside dimensions would suggest, because magic distorts space in strange ways, and it was probably the only library in the universe with Mobius shelves. But the librarian's mental catalogue was ticking over perfectly. He stopped by a soaring stack of musty books and swung himself up into the darkness. There was the sound of rustling paper, and a cloud of dust floated down to Trumon. Then the librarian was back, a slim volume in his hands. "Ugh," he said. Trumon took it gingerly. The cover was scratched and very dog-eared. The gold of its lettering had long ago curled off, but he could just make out in the old magic tongue of the Tsort Valley the words "Yet great temple hit Tsort, I history mystical." "Ugh," said the librarian anxiously. Trumon turned the pages cautiously. He wasn't very good at languages. He'd always found them highly inefficient things which by rights ought to be replaced by some sort of easily understood numerical system. But this seemed exactly what he was looking for. There were whole pages covered with meaningful hieroglyphs. "Is this the only book you've got about the Pyramid of Tsort?" he said slowly. "Ook." "You're quite sure?" "Ook." Trumon listened. He could hear a long way off the sound of approaching feet and arguing voices. But he'd been prepared for that, too. He reached into his pocket. "Would you like another banana?" he said. The forest of Skund was indeed enchanted, which was nothing unusual on the disc, and was also the only forest in the whole universe to be called, in the local language, "Your finger, you fool," which was the literal meaning of the word Skund. The reason for this is regrettably all too common. When the first explorers from the warm lands around the Circled Sea travelled into the chilly hinterland, they filled in the blank spaces on their maps by grabbing the nearest native, pointing at some distant landmark, speaking very clearly in a loud voice, and writing down whatever the bemused man told them. Thus were immortalized in generations of atlases such geographical oddities as "just a mountain," "I don't know," "what," and, of course, "your finger, you fool." Rain clouds clustered around the bald heights of Mount Ulskunrahod. Who is this fool who does not know what a mountain is? And the luggage settled itself more comfortably under a dripping tree, which tried unsuccessfully to strike up a conversation. Twoflower and Rincewind were arguing. The person they were arguing about sat on his mushroom and watched them with interest. He looked like someone who smelled like someone who lived in a mushroom, and that bothered Twoflower. "Well, why hasn't he got a red hat?" Rincewind hesitated, desperately trying to imagine what Twoflower was getting at. "What?" he said, giving in. "He should have a red hat," said Twoflower, "and he certainly ought to be cleaner and more sort of jolly. He doesn't look like any sort of gnome to me." "What are you going on about?" "Look at that beard," said Twoflower sternly. "I've seen better beards on a piece of cheese." "Look, he's 6 inches high, and he lives in a mushroom," snarled Rincewind. "Of course he's a bloody gnome." "We've only got his word for it." Rincewind looked down at the gnome. "Excuse me," he said. He took Twoflower to the other side of the clearing. "Listen," he said between his teeth. "If he was 15 feet tall, and he said he was a giant, we'd only have his word for that too, wouldn't we?" "He could be a goblin," said Twoflower defiantly. Rincewind looked back at the tiny figure, which was industriously picking its nose. "Well," he said, "so what? Gnome, goblin, pixie, so what?" "No, not a pixie," said Twoflower firmly. "Pixies, they wear these sort of green combinations, and they have pointy caps and little knobbly antenna thingies sticking out of their heads. I've seen pictures." "Where?" Twoflower hesitated and looked at his feet. "I think it was called the... The what? Called the what?" The little man took a sudden interest in the backs of his hands. "The Little Folks' Book of Flower Fairies," he muttered. Rincewind looked blank. "It's a book on how to avoid them?" he said. "Oh, no," said Twoflower hurriedly. "It tells you where to look for them. I can remember the pictures now." A dreamy look came over his face, and Rincewind groaned inwardly. "There was even a special fairy that came and took your teeth away." "What, came and pulled out your actual teeth?" No, you're wrong. I mean, After they'd fallen out, what you did was you put the tooth under your pillow, and the fairy came and took it away and left a wry new piece. Why? Why what? Why did it collect teeth? It just did. Rincewind formed a mental picture of some strange entity living in a castle made of teeth. It was the kind of mental picture you tried to forget. Unsuccessfully. He said. Red hats. He wondered whether to enlighten the tourist about what life was really like, when a frog was a good meal, a rabbit hole a useful place to shelter out of the rain, and an owl a drifting silent terror in the night. Moleskin trousers sounded quaint unless you personally had to remove them from their original owner when the vicious little sod was cornered in his burrow. As for red hats, anyone who went around a forest looking bright and conspicuous would only do so very, very briefly. He wanted to say, look, the life of gnomes and goblins is nasty, brutish, and short. So are they. He wanted to say all this and couldn't. For a man with an itch to see the whole of infinity, Two-Flower never actually moved outside his own head. Telling him the truth would be like kicking a spaniel.
Said
a voice by his foot. He looked down. The gnome, who had introduced himself as Swires, looked up. Rincewind had a very good ear for languages. The gnome had just said, I've got some newt sorbet left over from yesterday. Sounds wonderful, said Rincewind. Swires gave him another prod in the ankle.
The other bigger, is he all right?
He said solicitously. He's just suffering from reality shock, said Rincewind. You haven't got a red hat by any chance?
Wheat?
It's just a thought.
I know where there's some food for biggers,
said the gnome.
And shelter too, it's not far.
Rincewind looked at the lowering sky. The daylight was draining out of the landscape, and the clouds looked as if they had heard about snow and were considering the idea. Of course, people who lived in mushrooms couldn't necessarily be trusted, but right now a trap baited with a hot meal and clean sheets would have had the wizard hammering to get in. They set off. After a few seconds, the luggage got carefully to its feet and started to follow. Psst. It turned carefully, little legs moving up in a complicated pattern, and appeared to look up.
Is it good being joinery?
Said the tree anxiously.
Did it hurt?
The luggage seemed to think about this. Every brass handle, every knothole radiated extreme concentration. Then it shrugged its lid and waddled away. The tree sighed and shook a few dead leaves out of its twigs. The cottage was small, tumble-down, and as ornate as a doily. Some mad whittler had got to work on it, Rincewind decided, and had created terrible havoc before he could be dragged away. Every door, every shutter had its clusters of wooden grapes and half-moon cutouts, and there were massed outbreaks of fretwork pine cones all over the walls. He half expected a giant cuckoo to come hurtling out of an upper window. What he also noticed was the characteristic greasy feel in the air. Tiny green and purple sparks flashed from his fingernails. Strong magical field, he muttered. 100 million thaums at least. A thaum is the basic unit of magical strength. It has been universally established as the amount of magic needed to create one small white pigeon, or 3 normal-sized billiard balls.
End of CD 1. CD 2.
There's magic all over the place, said Swires. An old witch used to live around here. She went a long time ago, but the magic still keeps the house going.
Here, there's something odd about that door, said Two-Flower. Why should a house need magic to keep it going, said Rincewind. Two-Flower touched a wall gingerly.
It's all sticky.
Nougat, said Swires. Good grief. A real gingerbread cottage. Rincewind, a real gingerbread... Rincewind nodded glumly. Yeah, the confectionery school of architecture, he said. It never caught on. He looked suspiciously at the licorice door knocker.
It sort of regenerates,
said Swires.
Marvellous, really. You just don't get this sort of place nowadays. You just can't get the gingerbread.
Really? Said Rincewind gloomily.
Come on in, said the gnome. But mind the door, Matt.
Why?
Candy floss.
The great disk spun slowly under its toiling sun, and daylight pooled in hollows and finally drained away as night fell. In his chilly room in Unseen University, Trumon pored over the book, his lips moving as his finger traced the unfamiliar ancient script. He read that the Great Pyramid of Tsort, now long vanished, was made of 1,003,010 limestone blocks. He read that 10,000 slaves had been worked to death in its building. He learned that it was a maze of secret passages, their walls reputedly decorated with the distilled wisdom of ancient Tsort. He read that its height plus its length, divided by half its width, equaled exactly 1.67563, or precisely 1,237.98712567 times the difference between the distance to the sun and the weight of a small orange. He learned that 60 years had been devoted entirely to its construction. It all seemed, he thought, to be rather a lot of trouble to go to just to sharpen a razor blade. And in the forest of Scund, Two-Flower and Rincewind settled down to a meal of gingerbread mantelpiece and thought longingly of pickled onions. And far away, but set as it were on a collision course, the greatest hero the disc ever produced rolled himself a cigarette, entirely unaware of the role that lay in store for him. It was quite an interesting tailor-made that he twirled expertly between his fingers because, like many of the wandering wizards from whom he had picked up the art, he was in the habit of saving dog ends in a leather bag and rolling them into fresh smokes. The implacable law of averages therefore dictated that some of the tobacco had been smoked almost continuously for many years now. The thing he was trying unsuccessfully to light was, well, you could have coated roads with it. So great was the reputation of this person that a group of nomadic barbarian horsemen had respectfully invited him to join them as they sat around a horse-turd fire. The nomads of the hub regions usually migrated rimwards for the winter, and these were part of a tribe who had pitched their felt tents in the sweltering heat wave of a mere -3 degrees and were going around with peeling noses and complaining about heat stroke. The barbarian chieftain said, "What, then, are the greatest things that a man may find in life?" This is the sort of thing you're supposed to say to maintain step cred in barbarian circles. The man on his right thoughtfully drank his cocktail of mare's milk and snowcat blood and spoke thus.
"The crisp horizon of the steppe, the wind in your hair, a fresh horse under you."
The man on his left said,
"The cry of the white eagle in the heights, the fall of the snow in the forest, a true arrow in your bow."
The chieftain nodded and said,
"Surely it is the sight of your enemy slain, the humiliation of his tribe, and the lamentation of his women."
There was a general murmur of whiskery approval at this outrageous display. Then the chieftain turned respectfully to his guest, a small figure carefully warming his chilblains by the fire, and said,
"But our guest, whose name is legend, must tell us truly, what is it that a man may call the greatest things in life?"
The guest paused in the middle of another unsuccessful attempt to light up.
"What say?"
he said toothlessly.
"I said, what is it that a man may call the greatest things in life?"
The warriors leaned closer. This should be worth hearing. The guest thought long and hard, and then said with deliberation,
"Hot water, good dentistry, and soft lavatory paper."
Brilliant octarine light flared in the forge. Golder Weatherwax, stripped to the waist, his face hidden by a mask of smoked glass, squinted into the glow and brought a hammer down with surgical precision. The magic squealed and writhed in the tongs, but still he worked it, drawing it into a line of agonized fire. A floorboard creaked. Golder had spent many hours tuning them, always a wise precaution with an ambitious assistant who walked like a cat. D flat. That meant he was just to the right of the door. "Ah, Trumon," he said, without turning, and noted with some satisfaction the faint indrawing of breath behind him. "Good of you to come. Shut the door, will you?" Trumon pushed the heavy door, his face expressionless. On the high shelf above him, various bottled impossibilities wallowed in their pickle jars and watched him with interest. Like all wizards' workshops, the place looked as though a taxidermist had dropped his stock in a foundry and then had a fight with a maddened glass-blower, braining a passing crocodile in the process. It hung from the ceiling and smelt strongly of camphor. There were lamps and rings that Trumon itched to rub, and mirrors that looked as though they could repay a second glance. A pair of 7-league boots stirred restlessly in a cage. A whole library of grimoires, not of course as powerful as the octavo, but still heavy with spells, creaked and rattled their chains as they sensed the wizard's covetous glance on them. The naked power of it all stirred him as nothing else could. But he deplored the scruffiness and Golda's sense of theatre. For example, he happened to know that the green liquid bubbling mysteriously through a maze of contorted pipework on one of the benches was just green dye with soap in it, because he'd bribed one of the servants. One day, he thought, it's all going to go, starting with that bloody alligator. His knuckles whitened. "Well now," said Golda cheerfully, hanging up his apron and sitting back in his chair with the lion-paw arms and duck legs. "You sent me this meme thing." Trumon shrugged. "Memo. I merely pointed out, Lord, that the other orders have all sent agents to Scund Forest to recapture the spell, while you do nothing," he said. "No doubt you will reveal your reasons in good time." "Your faith shames me," said Golda. "The wizard who captures the spell will bring great honour on himself and his order," said Trumon. "The others have used boots and all manner of elsewhere spells. What do you propose using, Master?" Did I detect a hint of sarcasm there? "Absolutely not, Master. Not even a smidgen?" "Not even the merest smidgen, Master." "Good, because I don't propose to go." Golda reached down and picked up an ancient book. He mumbled a command and it creaked open. A bookmark, suspiciously like a tongue, flicked back into the binding. He fumbled down beside his cushion and produced a little leather bag of tobacco and a pipe the size of an incinerator. With all the skill of a terminal nicotine addict, he rubbed a nut of tobacco between his hands and tamped it into the bowl. He snapped his fingers and fire flared. He sucked deep, sighed with satisfaction, looked up. "Still here, Trumon?" "You summoned me, Master," said Trumon levelly. At least that's what his voice said. Deep in his grey eyes was the faintest glitter that said he had a list of every slight, every patronising twinkle, every gentle reproof, every knowing glance, and for every single one Golda's living brain was going to spend a year in acid. "Oh, yes, so I did. Humour the deficiencies of an old man," said Golda pleasantly. He held up the book he had been reading. "I don't hold with all this running about," he said. "It's all very dramatic, mucking about with magic carpets and the like, but it isn't true magic to my mind. Take 7-league boots now. If men were meant to walk 21 miles at a step, I'm sure God would have given us longer legs. Where was I?" "I'm not sure," said Trumon coldly. "Ah, yes. Strange that we could find nothing about the pyramid of sort in the library. You would have thought there'd be something, wouldn't you?" "The librarian will be disciplined, of course." Golda looked sideways at him. "Nothing drastic," he said. "Withhold his bananas, perhaps." They looked at each other for a moment. Golda broke off first. Looking hard at Trumon always bothered him. It had the same disconcerting effect as gazing into a mirror and seeing no one there. "Anyway," he said, "strangely enough, I found assistance elsewhere. In my own modest bookshelves, in fact. The Journal of Skrelt Changebasket, the founder of our order. You, my keen young man who would rush off so soon, do you know what happens when a wizard dies? Any spells he has memorized say themselves, said Trumon. It is one of the first things we learn. In fact, it is not true of the original 8 great spells. By dint of a close study, Skrelt learned that a great spell will simply take refuge in the nearest mind open and ready to receive it. Just push the big mirror over here, will you? Golder got to his feet and shuffled across to the forge, which was now cold. The strand of magic still writhed, though, at once present and not present, like a slit cut into another universe full of hot blue light. He picked it up easily, took a longbow from a rack, said a word of power, and watched with satisfaction as the magic grasped the ends of the bow and then tightened until the wood creaked. Then he selected an arrow. Trumon had tugged a heavy full-length mirror into the middle of the floor. When I am head of the order, he told himself, I certainly won't shuffle around in carpet slippers. Trumon, as mentioned earlier, felt that a lot could be done by fresh blood if only the dead wood could be removed. But just for the moment he was genuinely interested in seeing what the old fool would do next. He may have derived some satisfaction if he had known that Golder and Skrelt Changebasket were both absolutely wrong. Golder made a few passes in front of the glass, which clouded over and then cleared to show an aerial view of the forest of Skund. He looked at it intently while holding the bow with the arrow pointing vaguely at the ceiling. He muttered a few words like, allow for wind and speed of, say, 3 knots, and adjust for temperature, and then with a rather disappointing movement, released the arrow. If the laws of action and reaction had anything to do with it, it should have flopped to the ground a few feet away, but no one was listening to them. With a sound that defies description, but which for the sake of completeness can be thought of basically as spang plus 3 days' hard work in any decently equipped radiophonic workshop, the arrow vanished. Golder threw the bow aside and grinned. Of course, it'll take about an hour to get there, he said. Then the spell will simply follow the ionized path back here, to me. Remarkable, said Trumon, but any passing telepath would have read in letters 10 yards high. If you, then why not me? He looked down at the cluttered workbench, where a long and very sharp knife looked tailor-made for what he suddenly had in mind. Violence was not something he liked to be involved in except at one remove, but the Pyramid of Sort had been quite clear about the rewards for whoever brought all 8 spells together at the right time, and Trumon was not about to let years of painstaking work go for nothing because some old fool had a bright idea. "Would you like some cocoa while we're waiting?" said Golder, hobbling across the room to the servant's bell. "Certainly," said Trumon. He picked up the knife, weighing it for balance and accuracy. "I must congratulate you, Master. I can see that we must all get up very early in the morning to get the better of you." Golder laughed, and the knife left Trumon's hand at such speed that, because of the somewhat sluggish nature of disc light, it actually grew a bit shorter and a little more massive as it plunged with unerring aim towards Golder's neck. It didn't reach it. Instead, it swerved to one side and began a fast orbit, so fast that Golder appeared suddenly to be wearing a metal collar. He turned around, and to Trumon it seemed that he had suddenly grown several feet taller and much more powerful. The knife broke away and shuddered into the door, a mere shadow's depth from Trumon's ear. "Early in the morning," said Golder pleasantly. "My dear lad, you will need to stay up all night." "Have a bit more table," said Rincewind. "No, thanks, I don't like marzipan," said Two-Flower. "Anyway, I'm sure it's not right to eat other people's furniture." "Don't worry," said Swires. "The old witch hasn't been seen for years. They say she was done up good and proper by a couple of young tearaways." "Kids of today," commented Rincewind. "I blame the parents," said Two-Flower. Once you had made the necessary mental adjustments, the gingerbread cottage was quite a pleasant place. Residual magic kept it standing, and it was shunned by such local wild animals who hadn't already died of terminal tooth decay. A bright fire of licorice logs burned rather messily in the fireplace. Rincewind had tried gathering wood outside, but had given up. It's hard to burn wood that talks to you. He belched. "This isn't very healthy," he said. "I mean, why sweets? Why not crisp bread and cheese? Or salami? Now, I could do with a nice salami sofa."
"Search me," said Swires. "Old Granny Whitlow just did sweets. You should have seen her meringues."
"I have," said Rincewind. "I looked at the mattresses." "Gingerbread is more traditional," said Two-Flower. "What, for mattresses?"
"Don't be silly," said Two-Flower reasonably. "Whoever heard of a gingerbread mattress?"
Rincewind grunted. He was thinking of food, more accurately, of food in Ankh-Morpork. Funny how the old place seemed more attractive the further he got away from it. He only had to close his eyes to picture in dribbling detail the food stalls of 100 different cultures in the marketplaces. You could eat squishy, or shark's fin soup, so fresh that swimmers wouldn't go near it. And, "Do you think I could buy this place?" said Two-Flower. Rincewind hesitated. He'd found it always paid to think very carefully before answering Two-Flower's more surprising questions. "What for?" he said cautiously.
"Well, it just reeks of ambience."
"Oh."
"What's ambience?"
said Swires, sniffing cautiously and wearing the kind of expression that said he hadn't done it, whatever it was. "I think it's a kind of frog," said Rincewind. "Anyway, you can't buy this place because there isn't anyone to buy it from."
"I think I could probably arrange that on behalf of the Forest Council, of course," interrupted Swires, trying to avoid Rincewind's glare.
"And anyway, you couldn't take it with you. I mean, you could hardly pack it in the luggage, could you?" Rincewind indicated the luggage, which was lying by the fire and managing in some quite impossible way to look like a contented but alert tiger, and then looked back at Two-Flower. His face fell. "Could you?" he repeated. He had never quite come to terms with the fact that the inside of the luggage didn't seem to inhabit quite the same world as the outside. Of course, this was simply a byproduct of its essential weirdness, but it was disconcerting to see Two-Flower fill it full of dirty shirts and old socks, and then open the lid again on a pile of nice crisp laundry, smelling faintly of lavender. Two-Flower also bought a lot of quaint native artifacts, or, as Rincewind would put it, junk, and even a 7-foot ceremonial pig-tickling pole seemed to fit inside quite easily without sticking out anywhere. "I don't know," said Two-Flower. "You're a wizard. You know about these things." "Yes, well, of course, but baggage magic is a highly specialised art," said Rincewind. "Anyway, I'm sure the gnomes wouldn't really want to sell it. He groped through what he knew of Two-Flower's mad vocabulary. It's a tourist attraction."
"What's that?"
said Swires interestedly. "It means that lots of people like him will come and look at it," said Rincewind.
"Why?"
"Because," Rincewind groped for words, "it's quaint, oldie-worldy, folklore-esque. It's a delightful example of a vanished folk art steeped in the traditions of an age long gone."
"It is?"
said Swires, looking at the cottage in bewilderment. "Yes."
"All that?"
"Afraid so."
"I'll help you pack."
And the night wears on, under a blanket of lowering clouds which covers most of the disk, which is fortuitous because when it clears and the astrologers get a good view of the sky, they are going to get angry and upset. And in various parts of the forest, parties of wizards are getting lost and going round in circles, and hiding from each other and getting upset, because whenever they bump into a tree it apologizes to them. But unsteadily though it may be, many of them are getting quite close to the cottage, which is a good time to get back to the rambling buildings of Unseen University, and in particular the apartments of Greyhound Spold, currently the oldest wizard on the disk, and determined to keep it that way. He has just been extremely surprised and upset. For the last few hours he has been very busy. He may be deaf and a little hard of thinking, but elderly wizards have a very well-trained survival instinct, and they know that when a tall figure in a black robe and the latest in agricultural hand tools starts looking thoughtfully at you, it is time to act fast. The servants have been dismissed. The doorways have been sealed with a paste made from powdered mayflies, and protective octograms have been drawn on the windows. Rare and rather smelly oils have been poured in complex patterns on the floor, in designs which hurt the eyes and suggest the designer was drunk, or from some other dimension, or possibly both. In the very centre of the room is the 8-fold octogram of withholding, surrounded by red and green candles, and in the centre of that is a box made from wood of the curly fern pine, which grows to a great age, and it is lined with red silk and yet more protective amulets, because Greyhound Spold knows that death is looking for him, and has spent many years designing an impregnable hiding place. He has just set the complicated clockwork of the lock and shut the lid, lying back in the knowledge that here at last is the perfect defence against the most ultimate of all his enemies, although as yet he has not considered the important part that air holes must play in an enterprise of this kind. And right beside him, very close to his ear, a voice has just said,
"Dark in here, isn't it?"
It began to snow. The barley-sugar windows of the cottage showed bright and cheerful against the blackness. At one side of the clearing 3 tiny red points of light glowed momentarily, and there was the sound of a chesty cough, abruptly silenced.
"Shut up!"
hissed a third-rank wizard.
"They'll hear us."
"Who will? We gave the lads from the Brotherhood of the Hoodwinked the slip in the swamp, and those idiots from the Venerable Council of Seers went off the wrong way anyway."
"Yeah,"
said the most junior wizard,
"but who keeps talking to us? They say this is a magic wood. It's full of goblins and wolves and trees,"
said a voice out of the darkness high above. It possessed what can only be described as timbre.
"Yeah,"
said the youngest wizard. He sucked on his dog end and shivered. The leader of the party peered over the rock and watched the cottage.
"Right then,"
he said, knocking out his pipe on the heel of his 7-league boot, who squeaked in protest.
"We rush in, we grab them, we're away, okay?"
"You sure it's just people?"
said the youngest wizard nervously.
"Of course I'm sure," snarled the leader. "What do you expect, 3 bears?"
"There could be monsters. This is the sort of wood that has monsters."
"And trees," said a friendly voice from the branches.
"Yeah,"
said the leader cautiously. Rincewind looked carefully at the bed. It was quite a nice little bed in a sort of hard toffee inlaid with caramel, but he'd rather eat it than sleep in it, and it looked as though someone already had. "Someone's been eating my bed," he said. "I like toffee," said Two-Flower defensively. "If you don't watch out, the fairy will come and take all your teeth away," said Rincewind.
"No, that's elves,"
said Swires from the dressing-table.
"Elves do that. Toenails, too. Very touchy at times, elves can be."
Two-Flower sat down heavily on his bed. "You've got it wrong," he said. "Elves are noble and beautiful and wise and fair. I'm sure I read that somewhere." Swires and Rincewind's kneecap exchanged glances.
"I think you must be thinking about different elves," the gnome said slowly. "We've just got the other sort round here. Not that you'd call them quick-tempered," he added hastily. "Not if you didn't want to take your teeth home in your hat, anyway." There was the tiny distinctive sound of a nougat door opening. At the same time, from the other side of the cottage came the faintest of tinkles, like a rock smashing a barley-sugar window as delicately as possible. "What was that?" said Two-Flower. "Which one?" said Rincewind. There was the clonk of a heavy branch banging against the window-sill. With a cry of "Elves!" Swires scuttled across the floor to a mouse-hole and vanished. "What shall we do?" said Two-Flower. "Panic," said Rincewind, hopefully. He always held that panic was the best means of survival. Back in the olden days, his theory went people faced with hungry saber-toothed tigers could be divided very simply into those who panicked and those who stood there saying, "What a magnificent brute," and "Here, pussy." "There's a cupboard," said Two-Flower, pointing to a narrow door that was squeezed between the wall and the chimney-breast. They scrambled into sweet, musty darkness. There was the creak of a chocolate floorboard outside. Someone said, "I heard voices." Someone else said, "Yeah, downstairs. I think it's the hoodwinkers."
I thought you said we'd given them the slip.
Hey, you two, you can eat this place. Here, look, you can— Shut up.
There was a lot more creaking, and a muffled scream from downstairs where a venerable seer, creeping carefully through the darkness from the broken window, had trodden on the fingers of a hoodwinker who was hiding under the table. There was the sudden zip and zing of magic. "Bugger," said a voice outside. "They've got him. Let's go." There was more creaking, and then silence. After a while, Two Flower said, "Rincewind, I think there's a broomstick in this cupboard."
"Well, what's so unusual about that?"
"This one's got handlebars." There was a piercing shriek from below. In the darkness, a wizard had tried to open the luggage's lid. A crash from the scullery indicated the sudden arrival of a party of illuminated mages of the Unbroken Circle. "What do you think they're after?" whispered Two Flower.
"I don't know, but I think it might be a good idea not to find out," said Rincewind thoughtfully.
"You could be right." Rincewind pushed open the door gingerly. The room was empty. He tiptoed across to the window and looked down into the upturned faces of 3 brothers of the Order of Midnight. "That's him!" He drew back hurriedly and rushed for the stairs. The scene below was indescribable, but since that statement would earn the death penalty in the reign of Olaf Quimby II, the attempt better be made. Firstly, most of the struggling wizards were trying to illuminate the scene by various flames, fireballs, and magical glows, so the overall lighting gave the impression of a disco in a strobe light factory. Each man was trying to find a position from which he could see the rest of the room without being attacked himself, and absolutely everyone was trying to keep out of the way of the luggage, which had 2 venerable seers pinned in a corner and was snapping its lid at anyone who approached. But one wizard did happen to look up. "It's him!" Rincewind jerked back, and something bumped into him. He looked around hurriedly and stared where he saw Two Flower sitting on the broomstick, which was floating in mid-air. "The witch must have left it behind," said Two Flower. "A genuine magic broomstick." Rincewind hesitated. Octarine sparks were spitting off the broomstick's bristles, and he hated heights almost more than anything else. But what he really hated more than anything at all was a dozen very angry and bad-tempered wizards rushing up the stairs towards him, and this was happening. "All right," he said, "but I'll drive." He lashed out with a boot at a wizard who was halfway through a spell of binding and jumped onto the broomstick, which bobbed down the stairwell and then turned upside down so that Rincewind was horribly eye-to-eye with the Brother of Midnight. He yelped and gave the handlebars a convulsive twist. Several things happened at once. The broomstick shot forward and broke through the wall in a shower of crumbs. The luggage surged forwards and bit the brother in the leg, and with a strange whistling sound, an arrow appeared from nowhere, missed Rincewind by inches, and struck the luggage's lid with a very solid thud. The luggage vanished. In a little village deep in the forest, an ancient shaman threw a few more twigs on his fire and stared through the smoke at his shame-faced apprentice. "A box with legs on?" he said. "Yes, master. It just appeared out of the sky and looked at me," said the apprentice. "It had eyes, then, this box?" "No," began the apprentice, and stopped, puzzled. The old man frowned. "Many have seen Topaxi, god of the red mushroom, and they earn the name of shaman," he said. "Some have seen Skelde, spirit of the smoke, and they are called sorcerers. A few have been privileged to see Cheryl, the soul of the forest, and they are known as spirit masters. But none have seen a box with hundreds of legs that look to them without eyes, and they are known as idiot." The interruption was caused by a sudden screaming noise and a flurry of snow and sparks that blew the fire across the dark hut. There was a brief blurred vision, and then the opposite wall was blasted aside, and the apparition vanished. There was a long silence, then a slightly shorter silence. Then the old shaman said carefully, "You didn't just see 2 men go through upside down on a broomstick, shouting and screaming at each other, did you?" The boy looked at him levelly. "Certainly not," he said. The old man heaved a sigh of relief. "Thank goodness for that," he said. "Neither did I. The cottage was in turmoil because not only did the wizards want to follow the broomstick, they also wanted to prevent each other from doing so, and this led to several regrettable incidents. The most spectacular, and certainly the most tragic, happened when one seer attempted to use his 7-league boots without the proper sequence of spells and preparations. 7-league boots, as has already been intimated, are a tricksy form of magic at best, and he remembered too late that the utmost caution must be taken in using a means of transport which, when all is said and done, relies for its effectiveness on trying to put one foot 21 miles in front of the other. The first snowstorms of winter were raging, and in fact there was a suspiciously heavy covering of cloud over most of the disk. And yet from far above, and by the silver light of the Discworld's tiny moon, it presented one of the most beautiful sights in the multiverse. Great streamers of cloud, hundreds of miles long, swirled from the waterfall at the rim of the mountains of the hub. In the cold, crystal silence, the huge white spiral glittered frostily under the stars, imperceptibly turning, very much as though God had stirred his coffee and then poured the cream in. Nothing disturbed the glowing scene, which... Something small and distant broke through the cloud layer, trailing sheds of vapour. In the stratospheric calm, the sounds of bickering became sharp and clear.
"You said you could fly one of these things."
"No, I didn't. I just said you couldn't."
"But I've never been on one before."
"What a coincidence."
"Anyway, you said, look at the sky."
"No, I didn't."
"What's happened to the stars?"
And so it was that Rincewind and Twoflower became the first two people on the disk to see what the future held. 1,000 miles behind them, the hub mountain of Cori Celesti stabbed the sky and cast a knife-bright shadow across the broiling clouds, so that gods ought to have noticed too. But the gods don't normally look at the sky, and in any case were engaged in litigation with the ice giants who had refused to turn their radio down. Rimwards, in the direction of Great Artuin's travel, the sky had been swept of stars. In that circle of blackness there was just one star, a red and baleful star, a star like the glitter in the eye socket of a rabid mink. It was small and horrible and uncompromising, and the disk was being carried straight towards it. Rincewind knew precisely what to do in these circumstances. He screamed and pointed the broomstick straight down. Golda Weatherwax stood in the centre of the octagram and raised his hands.
"Ursalo, Dileptor, Kuhula, do my bidding."
A small mist formed over his head. He glanced sideways at Trumon, who was sulking at the edge of the magic circle.
"This next bit's quite impressive," he said. "Watch. Kot Bahai, Kot Sham. To me, O spirits of small isolated rocks and worried mice not less than 3 inches long."
"What?" said Trumon.
"That bit took quite a lot of research," agreed Golda, "especially the mice. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yes."
He raised his arms again. Trumon watched him and licked his lips distractedly. The old fool was really concentrating, bending his mind entirely to the spell, and hardly paying any attention to Trumon. Words of power rolled around the room, bouncing off the walls and scuttling out of sight behind shelves and jars. Trumon hesitated. Golda shut his eyes momentarily, his face a mask of ecstasy as he mouthed the final word. Trumon tensed, his fingers curling around the knife again, and Golda opened one eye, nodded at him, and sent a sideways blast of power that picked the younger man up and sent him sprawling against the wall. Golda winked at him and raised his arms again.
"To me, O spirits of—"
There was a thunderclap, an implosion of light, and a moment of complete physical uncertainty, during which even the walls seemed to turn in on themselves. Trumon heard a sharp intake of breath, and then a dull, solid thump. The room was suddenly silent. After a few minutes, Trumon crawled out from behind a chair and dusted himself off. He whistled a few bars of nothing much and turned towards the door with exaggerated care, looking at the ceiling as if he'd never seen it before. He moved in a way that suggested he was attempting the world speed record for the nonchalant walk. The luggage squatted in the centre of the circle and opened its lid. Trumon stopped. He turned very, very carefully, dreading what he might see. The luggage seemed to contain some clean laundry, smelling slightly of lavender. Somehow it was quite the most terrifying thing the wizard had ever seen. "Well, he said, "you wouldn't have seen another wizard around here, by any chance?" The luggage contrived to look more menacing. "Oh," said Trumon. "Well, fine. It doesn't matter." He pulled vaguely at the hem of his robe, and took a brief interest in the detail of its stitching. When he looked up, the horrible box was still there. "Goodbye," he said, and ran. He managed to get through the door just in time. "Rincewind?" Rincewind opened his eyes. Not that it helped much. It just meant that instead of seeing nothing but blackness, he saw nothing but whiteness, which surprisingly was worse. "Are you all right?" "No." "Ah." Rincewind sat up. He appeared to be on a rock speckled with snow, but it didn't seem to be everything a rock ought to be. For example, it shouldn't be moving. Snow blew around him. Twoflower was a few feet away, a look of genuine concern on his face. Rincewind groaned. His bones were very angry at the treatment they had recently received, and were queuing up to complain. "What now?" he said. "You know when we were flying and I was worried we might hit something in the storm, and you said the only thing we could possibly hit at this height was a cloud stuffed with rocks?" "Well?" "How did you know?" Rincewind looked around, but for all the variety and interest in the scene around him, they might as well have been in the inside of a ping-pong ball. The rock underneath was, well, rocking. He ran his hands over it, and felt the scoring of chisels. When he put an ear to the cold, wet stone, he fancied he could hear a dull, slow thumping, like a heartbeat. He crawled forward until he came to an edge, and peered very cautiously over it. At that moment, the rock must have been passing over a break in the clouds, because he caught a dim but horribly distant view of jagged-edged mountain peaks. They were a long way down. He gurgled incoherently and inched his way backwards. "This is ridiculous," he told Twoflower. "Rocks don't fly. They're noted for not doing it." "Maybe they would if they could," said Twoflower. "Perhaps this one just found out how." "Let's hope it doesn't forget again," said Rincewind. He huddled up in his soaking robe and looked glumly at the cloud around him. He supposed there were some people somewhere who had some control over their lives. They got up in the mornings and went to bed at night in the reasonable certainty of not falling over the edge of the world, or being attacked by lunatics, or waking up on a rock with ideas above its station. He dimly remembered leading a life like that once. Rincewind sniffed. The rock smelt of frying. The smell seemed to be coming up from a head, and appealed straight to his stomach. "Can you smell anything?" he said. "I think it's bacon," said Twoflower. "I hope it's bacon," said Rincewind, "because I'm going to eat it." He stood up on the trembling stone and tottered forward into the clouds, peering through the wet gloom. At the front or leading edge of the rock, a small druid was sitting cross-legged in front of a small fire. A square of oilskin was tied across his head and knotted under his chin. He was poking at a pan of bacon with an ornamental sickle. Said Rincewind. The druid looked up and dropped the pan into the fire. He leapt to his feet and gripped the sickle aggressively, or at least as aggressively as anyone can look in a long, wet, white nightshirt and a dripping headscarf. "I warn you, I shall deal harshly with hijackers," he said, and sneezed violently. "We'll help," said Rincewind, looking longingly at the burning bacon. This seemed to puzzle the druid, who, to Rincewind's mild surprise, was quite young. He supposed there had to be such a thing as young druids, theoretically. It was just that he'd never imagined them. "You're not trying to steal the rock," said the druid, lowering the sickle a fraction. "I didn't even know you could steal rocks," said Rincewind, wearily. "Excuse me," said Twoflower politely. "I think your breakfast is on fire." The druid glanced down and flailed ineffectually at the flames. Rincewind hurried forward to help. There was a fair amount of smoke, ash, and confusion, and the shared triumph of actually rescuing a few pieces of rather charred bacon did more good than a whole book on diplomacy.
"How did you get here, actually?" said the Druid. "We're 500 feet up, unless I've got the runes wrong again."
Rincewind tried not to think about height.
"We sort of dropped in as we were passing," he said.
"On our way to the ground," Two-Flower added.
"Only your rock broke our fall," said
Rincewind. His back complained.
"Thanks," he added. "I thought we'd run into some turbulence a while back," said the Druid, whose name turned out to be Belafon. "That must have been you," he shivered. "It must be morning by now," he said. "Sod the rules, I'm taking us up. Hang on."
"What to?" said Rincewind.
"Well, just indicate a general unwillingness to fall off," said Belafon.
He took a large iron pendulum out of his robe and swung it in a series of baffling sweeps over the fire. Clouds whipped around them. There was a horrible feeling of heaviness, and suddenly the rock burst into sunlight. It levelled off a few feet above the clouds in a cold but bright blue sky. The clouds that had seemed chillingly distant last night and horribly clammy this morning were now a fleecy white carpet, stretching away in all directions. A few mountain peaks stood out like islands. Behind the rock, the wind of its passage sculpted the clouds into transient whirls. The rock, it was about 30 feet long and 10 feet wide, and bluish. "What an amazing panorama," said Two-Flower, his eyes shining.
What's keeping us up?" said Rincewind.
"Persuasion," said Belafon, wringing out the hem of his robe.
"Ah," said Rincewind sagely.
"Keeping them up is easy," said the Druid, holding up a thumb and squinting down the length of his arm at a distant mountain. "The hard part is landing."
"You wouldn't think so, would you?" said Two-Flower.
"Persuasion is what keeps the whole universe together," said Belafon. "It's no good saying it's all done by magic." Rincewind happened to glance down through the thinning cloud to a snowy landscape a considerable distance below. He knew he was in the presence of a madman, but he was used to that. If listening to this madman meant he stayed up here, he was all ears. Belafon sat down with his feet dangling over the edge of the rock.
"Look, don't worry," he said. "If you keep thinking the rock shouldn't be flying, it might hear you and become persuaded, and you will turn out to be right, okay? It's obvious you aren't up to date with modern thinking."
"So it would seem," said Rincewind weakly. He was trying not to think about rocks on the ground. He was trying to think about rocks swooping like swallows, bounding across landscapes in the sheer joy of levity, zooming skywards in a... He was horribly aware he wasn't very good at it. The Druids of the Disc prided themselves on their forward-looking approach to the discovery of the mysteries of the universe. Of course, like Druids everywhere, they believed in the essential unity of all life, the healing power of plants, the natural rhythm of the seasons, and the burning alive of anyone who didn't approach all this in the right frame of mind. But they had also thought long and hard about the very basis of creation, and had formulated the following theory. The universe, they said, depended for its operation on the balance of four forces which they identified as charm, persuasion, uncertainty, and bloody-mindedness. Thus it was that the sun and moon orbited the disk because they were persuaded not to fall down, but didn't actually fly away because of uncertainty. Charm allowed trees to grow, and bloody-mindedness kept them up, and so on. Some Druids suggested that there were certain flaws in this theory, but senior Druids explained very pointedly that there was indeed room for informed argument, the cut and thrust of exciting scientific debate, and basically it lay on top of the next solstice bonfire.
"Ah, so you're an astronomer," said Two-Flower.
"Oh, no," said Belafon, as the rock drifted gently around the curve of a mountain.
"I'm a computer hardware consultant."
"What's a computer hardware?"
"Well, this is," said the Druid, tapping the rock with a sandalled foot. "Part of one, anyway. It's a replacement. I'm delivering it. They're having trouble with the big circles up on the vortex planes. So they say, anyway. I wish I had a bronze torque for every user who didn't read the manual." He shrugged.
What use is it then, exactly?" asked Rincewind, anything to keep his mind off the drop below.
"You can use it to tell you what time of year it is," said Belafon.
"Ah, you mean if it's covered in snow, then it must be winter?"
"Yes. No. Supposing you wanted to know when a particular star is going to rise."
"Why?" said Two-Flower, radiating polite interest. Well, maybe you want to know when to plant your crops, said Bellerophon, sweating a little. Or maybe... I'll lend you my almanac if you like, said Two-Flower. Almanac? It's a book that tells you what day it is, said Rincewind wearily. It'd be right up your ley line. Bellerophon stiffened. Book? He said. Like, with paper? Yes. That doesn't sound very reliable to me, said the Druid nastily. How can a book know what day it is? Paper can't count. He stamped off to the front of the rock, causing it to wallow alarmingly. Rincewind swallowed hard and beckoned Two-Flower closer. Have you ever heard of culture shock? He hissed. What's that? It's what happens when people spend 500 years trying to get a stone circle to work properly, and then someone comes up with a little book with a page for every day and little chatty bits saying things like, now is a good time to plant broad beans, and early to rise, early to bed makes a man healthy, wealthy, and dead. And do you know what the most important thing to remember about culture shock? Rincewind paused for breath and moved his lips, silently trying to remember where the sentence had got to. Is, he concluded. What? Don't give it to a man flying 1,000-ton rock. Has it gone? Trumon peered cautiously over the battlements of the Tower of Art, the great spire of crumbling masonry that loomed over Unseen University. The cluster of students and instructors of magic far below nodded. Are you sure? The bursar cupped his hands and shouted. It broke down the hubward door and escaped an hour ago, sir, he yelled. Wrong, said Trumon. It left. We escaped. Well, I'll be getting down then. Did it get anyone? The bursar swallowed. He was not a wizard, but a kind, good-natured man who should not have had to see the things he had witnessed in the past hour. Of course, it wasn't unknown for small demons, coloured lights, and various half-materialised imaginings to wander around the campus. But there had been something about the implacable onslaught of the luggage that had unnerved him. Trying to stop it would have been like trying to wrestle a glacier. It swallowed the Dean of Liberal Studies, sir, he shouted. Trumon brightened. It's an ill wind, he murmured. He started down the long spiral staircase. After a while he smiled, a thin, tight smile. The day was definitely improving. There was a lot of organising to do, and if there was something Trumon really liked, it was organising. The rock swooped across the high plains, whipping snow from the drifts a mere few feet below. Bellerophon scuttled about urgently, smearing a little mistletoe ointment here, chalking a rune there, while Rincewind cowered in terror and exhaustion, and Two-Flower worried about his luggage. "Up ahead!" screamed the Druid above the noise of the slipstream. "Behold, the great computer of the skies!" Rincewind peered between his fingers. On the distant skyline was an immense construction of grey and black slabs, arranged in concentric circles and mystic avenues, gaunt and forbidding against the snow. Surely men couldn't have moved those nascent mountains. Surely a troop of giants had been turned to stone by some... "It looks like a lot of rocks," said Two-Flower. Bellerophon hesitated in mid-gesture. "What?" he said. "It's very nice," added the tourist hurriedly. He sought for a word. "Ethnic," he decided. The Druid stiffened. "Nice," he said. "A triumph of the silicone chunk. A miracle of modern Masonic technology. Nice!" "Oh, yes," said Two-Flower, to whom sarcasm was merely a 7-letter word beginning with S. "What does ethnic mean?" said the Druid. "It means terribly impressive," said Rincewind hurriedly, "and we seem to be in danger of landing, if you don't mind." Bellerophon turned around, only slightly mollified. He raised his arms wide and shouted a series of untranslatable words ending with "nice" in a hurt whisper. The rock slowed, drifted sideways in a billow of snow, and hovered over the circle. Down below, a druid waved 2 bunches of mistletoe in complicated patterns, and Bellerophon skillfully brought the massive slab to rest across 2 giant uprights with the faintest of clicks. Rincewind let his breath out in a long sigh. It hurried off to hide somewhere. A ladder banged against the side of the slab, and the head of an elderly druid appeared over the edge. He gave the 2 passengers a puzzled glance, and then looked up at Bellerophon.
"About bloody time," he said. 7 weeks the Hog's Watch night, and it's gone down on us again.
"Hello, Zachariah," said Bellerophon. "What happened this time?"
"It's all totally fouled up. Today it predicted sunrise 3 minutes early. Talk about a klutz, boy. This is it."
Bellerophon clambered onto the ladder and disappeared from view. The passengers looked at each other, and then stared down into the vast open space between the inner circle of stones. "What shall we do now?" said Two-Flower. "We could go to sleep," suggested Rincewind. Two-Flower ignored him and climbed down the ladder. Around the circle, druids were tapping the megaliths with little hammers and listening intently. Several of the huge stones were lying on their sides, and each was surrounded by another crowd of druids who were examining it carefully and arguing amongst themselves. Arcane phrases floated up to where Rincewind sat.
"It can't be software incompatibility. The chant of the trodden spiral was designed for concentric rings, idiot." "I say fire it up again and try a simple moon ceremony." All right. Nothing's wrong with the stones. It's just that the universe has gone wrong, right?" Through the mists of his exhausted mind, Rincewind remembered the horrible star they'd seen in the sky. Something had gone wrong with the universe last night. How had he come to be back on the disk? He had a feeling that the answers were somewhere inside his head, and an even more unpleasant feeling began to dawn on him that something else was watching the scene below, watching it from behind his eyes. The spell had crept from its lair deep in the untrodden dirt roads of his mind, and was sitting, bold as brass, in his forebrain, watching the passing scene, and doing the mental equivalent of eating popcorn. He tried to push it back, and the world vanished. He was in darkness, a warm, musty darkness, the darkness of the tomb, the velvet blackness of the mummy case. There was a strong smell of old leather and the sourness of ancient paper. The paper rustled. He felt that the darkness was full of unimaginable horrors, and the trouble with unimaginable horrors was that they were only too easy to imagine.
"Rincewind,"
said a voice. Rincewind had never heard a lizard speak, but if one did, it would have a voice like that. He said. "Yes?" The voice chuckled, a strange sound, rather papery.
"You ought to say, 'Where am I?'"
it said. "Would I like it if I knew?" said Rincewind. He stared hard at the darkness. Now that he was accustomed to it, he could see something vague, hardly bright enough to be anything at all, just the merest tracery in the air. Something strangely familiar. "All right," he said. "Where am I?"
"You are dreaming."
"Can I wake up now, please?"
"No,"
said another voice, as old and dry as the first, but still slightly different.
"We have something very important to tell you,"
said a third voice, if anything more corpse-dry than the others. Rincewind nodded stupidly. In the back of his mind the spell lurked and peered cautiously over his mental shoulder.
"You've caused us a lot of trouble, young Rincewind," the voice went on. "All this dropping over the edge of the world with no thought for other people. We had to seriously distort reality, you know.
Gosh.
And now you have a very important task ahead of you."
"Oh, good."
"Many years ago we arranged for one of our number to hide in your head because we could foresee a time coming when you would need to play a very important role."
"Me? Why?"
"You run away a lot,"
said one of the voices.
"That is good. You are a survivor."
"Survivor? I've nearly been killed dozens of times."
"Exactly.
"Oh."
But try not to fall off the disc again. We really can't have that."
"Who are we, exactly?" said Rincewind. There was a rustling in the darkness.
"In the beginning was the Word,"
said a dry voice right behind him.
"It was the egg,"
corrected another voice.
"I distinctly remember the great egg of the universe, slightly rubbery." "You're both wrong, in fact. I'm sure it was the primordial slime."
A voice by Rincewind's knee said,
"No, that came afterwards. There was a firmament first. Lots of firmament. Rather sticky, like candy floss. Very syrupy, in fact." "In case anyone's interested,"
said a crackly voice on Rincewind's left.
"You're all wrong. In the beginning was the clearing of the throat. Then the Word. Pardon me, the slime. Distinctly rubbery, I thought."
There was a pause. Then a voice said carefully,
"Anyway, whatever it was, we remember it distinctly." "Quite so." "Exactly. And our task is to see that nothing dreadful happens to it, Rincewind."
Rincewind squinted into the blackness. "Would you kindly explain what you're talking about?" There was a papery sigh.
"So much for metaphor," said one of the voices. "Look, it is very important you safeguard the spell in your head and bring it back to us at the right time. You understand? So that when the moment is precisely right, we can be said. Do you understand?"
End of CD 2. CD 3.
Rincewind thought, "We can be said?" And it dawned on him what the tracery was ahead of him. It was writing on a page, seen from underneath. "I'm in the octavo," he said. "In certain metaphysical respects," said one of the voices in offhand tones. It came closer. He could feel the dry rustling right in front of his nose. He ran away. The single red dot glowed in its patch of darkness. Trumon, still wearing the ceremonial robes from his inauguration as head of the Order, couldn't rid himself of the feeling that it had grown slightly while he watched. He turned away from the window with a shudder. "Well," he said. It's a star," said the professor of astrology. I think." "You think?" The astrologer winced. They were standing in Unseen University's observatory, and the tiny ruby pinpoint on the horizon wasn't glaring at him any worse than his new master. "Well, you see, the point is that we've always believed stars to be pretty much the same as our sun." "You mean balls of fire about a mile across?" "Yes, but this one is well, big." "Bigger than the sun?" said Trumon. He'd always considered a mile-wide ball of fire quite impressive, although he disapproved of stars on principle. They made the sky look untidy. A lot bigger," said the astrologer slowly. "Bigger than Great Artuin's head, perhaps?" The astrologer looked wretched. "Bigger than Great Artuin and the disk together," he said. "We've checked," he added hurriedly, and we're quite sure." "That is big," agreed Trumon. "The word huge comes to mind." "Massive," agreed the astrologer hurriedly. Trumon paced the broad mosaic floor of the observatory, which was inlaid with the signs of the disk zodiac. There were 64 of them, from Weezen, the double-headed kangaroo, to Gahuli, the vase of tulips, a constellation of great religious significance whose meaning, alas, was now lost. He paused on the blue and gold tilework of Mubbo the hyena, and turned suddenly. "We're going to hit it?" he asked. "I'm afraid so, sir," said the astrologer. Trumon walked a few paces forward, stroking his beard thoughtfully. He paused on the cusp of Okjok the salesman and the celestial parsnip. "I'm not an expert in these matters," he said, "but I imagine this would not be a good thing?" "No, sir." "Very hot stars?" The astrologer swallowed. "Yes, sir." "We'd be burned up?" "Eventually. Of course, before that there would be disk quakes, tidal waves, gravitational disruption, and probably the atmosphere would be stripped away." "Ah. In a word, lack of decent organization." The astrologer hesitated and gave in. "You could say so, sir." "People would panic." "Fairly briefly, I'm afraid." Said Trumon, who was just passing over the perhaps gate and orbiting smoothly towards the cow of heaven. He squinted up again at the red gleam on the horizon. He appeared to reach a decision. "We can't find Rincewind," he said, "and if we can't find Rincewind, we can't find the 8th spell of the Octavo. But we believe that the Octavo must be read to avert catastrophe. Otherwise, why did the Creator leave it behind?" "Perhaps he was just forgetful," suggested the astrologer. Trumon glared at him. "The other orders are searching all the lands between here and the hub," he continued, counting the points on his fingers, "because it seems unreasonable that a man can fly into a cloud and not come out." "Unless it was stuffed with rocks," said the astrologer, in a wretched, and as it turned out entirely unsuccessful attempt to lighten the mood. "But come down he must somewhere. Where, we ask ourselves." "Where?" said the astrologer, loyally. "And immediately a course of action suggests itself to us." "Ah," said the astrologer, running in an attempt to keep up as the wizard stalked across the two fat cousins. "And that course is?" The astrologer looked up into two eyes as grey and bland as steel. "We stop looking," he ventured. "Precisely. We use the gifts the Creator has given us. To wit, we look down, and what is it we see?" The astrologer groaned inwardly. He looked down. "Tiles?" he hazarded. "Tiles, yes, which together make up the—" Trumon looked expectant. "Zodiac?" ventured the astrologer, a desperate man. "Right, and therefore all we need to do is cast Rincewind's precise horoscope, and we will know exactly where he is." The astrologer grinned like a man who, having tap-danced on quicksand, feels the press of solid rock under his feet. "I shall need to know his precise place and time of birth," he said. "Easily done. I copied them out of the university files before I came up here." The astrologer looked at the notes, and his forehead wrinkled. He crossed the room and pulled out a wide drawer full of charts. He read the notes again. He picked up a complicated pair of compasses and made some passes across the charts. He picked up a small brass astrolabe and cranked it carefully. He whistled between his teeth. He picked up a piece of chalk and scribbled some numbers on a blackboard. Trumon, meanwhile, had been staring out at the new star. He thought, "The legend in the Pyramid of Sort says that whoever says the 8 spells together when the disk is in danger will obtain all that he truly desires, and it will be so soon." And he thought, "I remember Rincewind. Wasn't he the scruffy boy who always came bottom of the class when we were training? Not a magical bone in his body. Let me get him in front of me and we'll see if we can't get all 8. The astrologer said, Oh, gosh, under his breath. Trumon spun around. Well? Fascinating chart, said the astrologer breathlessly. His forehead wrinkled. Bit strange, really, he said. How strange? He was born under the small boring group of faint stars, which, as you know, lies between the flying moose and the knotted string. It is said that even the ancients couldn't find anything interesting to say about the sign, which— Yes, get on with it, said Trumon irritably. It's the sign traditionally associated with chessboard makers, sellers of onions, manufacturers of plaster images of small religious significance, and people allergic to pewter. Not a wizard sign at all, and at the time of his birth, the shadow of Cori Celesti— I don't want to know all the mechanical details, growled Trumon. Just give me his horoscope. The astrologer, who had been rather enjoying himself, sighed and made a few additional calculations. Very well, he said. It reads as follows. Today is a good time for making new friends. A good deed may have unforeseen consequences. Don't upset any druids. You will soon be going on a very strange journey. Your lucky food is small cucumbers. People pointing knives at you are probably up to no good. P.S. We really mean it about druids. Druids, said Trumon. I wonder. Are you all right? Said Two-Flower. Rincewind opened his eyes. The wizard sat up hurriedly and grabbed Two-Flower by the shirt. I want to leave here, he said urgently, right now. But there's going to be an ancient and traditional ceremony. I don't care how ancient. I want the feel of honest cobbles under my feet. I want the old familiar smell of cesspits. I want to go where there's lots of people and fires and roofs and walls and friendly things like that. I want to go home. He found that he had this sudden, desperate longing for the fuming, smoky streets of Ankh-Morpork, which was always at its best in the spring, when the gummy sheen on the turbid waters of the Ankh River had a special iridescence, and the eaves were full of bird-song, or at least birds coughing rhythmically. A tear sprang to his eyes as he recalled the subtle play of light on the Temple of Small Gods, a noted local landmark, and a lump came to his throat when he remembered the fried fish stall on the junction of Midden Street and the Street of Cunning Artificers. He thought of the gherkins they sold there, great green things lurking at the bottom of their jar like drowned whales. They called to Rincewind across the miles, promising to introduce him to the pickled eggs in the next jar. He thought of the cosy livery stable lofts and warm gratings where he spent his nights. Foolishly, he had sometimes jibed at this way of life. It seemed incredible now, but he had found it boring. Now he had had enough. He was going home. Pickled gherkins, I hear you calling. He pushed Two-Flower aside, gathered his tattered robe around him with great dignity, set his face towards that area of horizon he believed to contain the city of his birth, and with intense determination and considerable absent-mindedness stepped right off the top of a 30-foot trilithon. Some 10 minutes later, when a worried and rather contrite Two-Flower dug him out of the large snowdrift at the base of the stones, his expression hadn't changed. Two-Flower peered at him. "Are you all right?" he said. "How many fingers am I holding up?" "I want to go home." "Okay." "No, don't try and talk me out of it. I've had enough. I'd like to say it's been great fun, but I can't. And— What?" "I said okay," said Two-Flower. "I'd quite like to see Ankh-Morpork again. I expect they've rebuilt quite a lot of it by now." It should be noted that the last time the two of them had seen the city it was burning quite fiercely, a fact which had a lot to do with Two-Flower introducing the concept of fire insurance to a venial but ignorant populace. But devastating fires were a regular feature of Morporkian life, and it had always been cheerfully and meticulously rebuilt, using the traditional local materials of tinder-dry wood and thatch waterproofed with tar. "Oh," said Rincewind, deflating a bit. "Oh, right. Oh, right then. Good. Perhaps we'd better be off then." He scrambled up and brushed the snow off himself. "Only I think we should wait until morning," added Two-Flower. "Why?" Well, because it's freezing cold. We don't really know where we are. The luggage has gone missing. It's getting dark. Rincewind paused. In the deep canyons of his mind, he thought he heard the distant rustle of ancient paper. He had a horrible feeling that his dreams were going to be very repetitive from now on, and he had much better things to do than be lectured by a bunch of ancient spells who couldn't even agree on how the universe began. A tiny, dry voice at the back of his brain said, "What things?" "Oh, shut up," he said. "I only said it's freezing cold, and—" Two-Flower began. "I didn't mean you. I meant me." "What?" "Oh, shut up," said Rincewind wearily. "I don't suppose there's anything to eat around here." The giant stones were black and menacing against the dying green light of sunset. The inner circle was full of druids, scurrying around by the light of several bonfires and tuning up all the necessary peripherals of a stone computer, like ram skulls on poles topped with mistletoe, banners embroidered with twisted snakes, and so on. Behind the circles of firelight, a large number of plains people had gathered. Druidic festivals were always popular, especially when things went wrong. Rincewind stared at them. "What's going on?" "Oh, well," said Two-Flower enthusiastically, "apparently there's this ceremony dating back for thousands of years to celebrate the, rebirth of the moon, or possibly the sun. No, I'm pretty certain it's the moon. Apparently it's very solemn and beautiful and invested with a quiet dignity." Rincewind shivered. He always began to worry when Two-Flower started to talk like that. At least he hadn't said picturesque or quaint yet. Rincewind had never found a satisfactory translation for those words, but the nearest he'd been able to come was trouble. "I wish the luggage was here," said the tourist regretfully. "I could use my picture box. It sounds very quaint and picturesque." The crowd stirred expectantly. Apparently, things were about to start. "Look," said Rincewind urgently, "druids are priests. You must remember that. Don't do anything to upset them. But don't offer to buy the stones. Don't start talking about quaint native folk ways. I thought, really, don't try to sell them insurance. That always upsets them." "But they're priests," wailed Two-Flower. Rincewind paused. "Yes," he said, "that's the whole point, isn't it?" At the far side of the outer circle, some sort of procession was forming up. "But priests are good, kind men," said Two-Flower. "At home they go around with begging bowls. It's their only possession," he added. "Ah," said Rincewind, not certain he understood. "This would be for putting the blood in, right?" "Blood?" "Yes, from sacrifices." Rincewind thought about the priests he had known at home. He was, of course, anxious not to make an enemy of any god, and had attended any number of temple functions, and on the whole he thought that the most accurate definition of any priest in the Circle C region was someone who spent quite a lot of time gory to the armpits. Two-Flower looked horrified. "Oh, no," he said. "Where I come from, priests are holy men who have dedicated themselves to lives of poverty, good works, and the study of the nature of God." Rincewind considered this novel proposition. "No sacrifices?" he said. "Absolutely not." Rincewind gave up. "Well," he said, "they don't sound very holy to me." There was a loud blarting noise from a band of bronze trumpets. Rincewind looked around. A line of druids marched slowly past, their long sickles hung with sprays of mistletoe. Various junior druids and apprentices followed them, playing a variety of percussion instruments that were traditionally supposed to drive away evil spirits, and quite probably succeeded. Torchlight made excitingly dramatic patterns on the stones, which stood ominously against the green-lit sky. Hubwards, the shimmering curtains of the Aurora Coriolis began to wink and glitter among the stars as a million ice crystals danced in the disk's magical field. "Bellerophon explained it all to me," whispered Two-Flower. "We're going to see a time-honoured ceremony that celebrates the oneness of man with the universe. That was what he said." Rincewind looked sourly at the procession. As the druids spread out around a great flat stone that dominated the centre of the circle, he couldn't help noticing the attractive, if rather pale young lady in their midst. She wore a long white robe, a gold torque around her neck, and an expression of vague apprehension. "Is she a druidess?" said Two-Flower. "I don't think so," said Rincewind slowly. The druids began to chant. It was, Rincewind felt, a particularly nasty and rather dull chant, which sounded very much as if it was going to build up to an abrupt crescendo. The sight of the young woman lying down on the big stone didn't do anything to derail his train of thought. "I want to stay," said Two-Flower. "I think ceremonies like this hark back to a primitive simplicity, which—" "Yes, yes," said Rincewind, "but they're going to sacrifice her, if you must know." Two-Flower looked at him in astonishment. "What? Kill her?" "Yes." "Why?" "Don't ask me. To make the crops grow or the moon rise or something. Or maybe they're just keen on killing people. That's religion for you." He became aware of a low humming sound, not so much heard as felt. It seemed to be coming from the stone next to them. Little points of light flickered under its surface, like mica specks. Two-Flower was opening and shutting his mouth. "Can't they just use flowers and berries and things?" he said. "Sort of symbolic?" "Nope." "Has anyone ever tried?" Rincewind sighed. "Look," he said, "no self-respecting high priest is going to go through all the business with the trumpets and the processions and the banners and everything, and then shove his knife into a daffodil and a couple of plums. You've got to face it. All this stuff about golden boughs and the cycles of nature and stuff just boils down to sex and violence, usually at the same time." To his amazement, Two-Flower's lip was trembling. Two-Flower didn't just look at the world through rose-tinted spectacles, Rincewind knew. He looked at it through a rose-tinted brain, too, and heard it through rose-tinted ears. The chant was rising inexorably to a crescendo. The head druid was testing the edge of his sickle, and all eyes were turned to the finger of stone on the snowy hills beyond the circle, where the moon was due to make a guest appearance. "It's no use you—" But Rincewind was talking to himself.
However, the chilly landscape outside the circle was not entirely devoid of life. For one thing, a party of wizards was even now drawing near, alerted by Trumon. But a small and solitary figure was also watching from the cover of a handy fallen stone. One of the Disc's greatest legends watched the events in the stone circle with considerable interest. He saw the druids circle and chant, saw the chief druid raise the sickle, heard the voice. "I say, excuse me, can I have a word?" Rincewind looked around desperately for a way of escape. There wasn't one. Two-Flower was standing by the altar stone with one finger in the air and an attitude of polite determination. Rincewind remembered one day when Two-Flower had thought a passing drover was beating his cattle too hard, and the case he had made for decency towards animals had left Rincewind severely trampled and lightly gored. The druids were looking at Two-Flower with the kind of expression normally reserved for mad sheep, or the sudden appearance of a rain of frogs. Rincewind couldn't quite hear what Two-Flower was saying, but a few phrases like ethnic folkways and nuts and flowers floated across the hushed circle. Then, fingers like a bunch of cheese straws clamped over the wizard's mouth, and an extremely sharp cutting edge pinked his Adam's apple, and a damp voice right by his ear said, "Not a sound, or you is a dead man." Rincewind's eyes swiveled in their sockets as if trying to find a way out.
"If you don't want me to say anything, how will you know I understand what you just said?"
he hissed.
"Shut up and tell me what the other idiot is doing."
"No, but look, if I've got to shut up, how can I
The knife at his throat became a hot streak of pain, and Rincewind decided to give logic a miss.
"His name's Two-Flower. He isn't from these parts."
"Doesn't look like it. Friend of yours?"
"We've got this sort of hate relationship, yes."
Rincewind couldn't see his captor, but by the feel of it he had a body made of coat hangers. He also smelt strongly of peppermints.
"He has got guts, I'll give him that. Do exactly what I say, and it is just possible he won't end up with them wrapped around a stone." They're not very ecumenical around here, you see. It was at that moment that the moon, in due obedience to the laws of persuasion, rose. Although in deference to the laws of computing, it wasn't anywhere near where the stones said it should be. But what was there, peeking through the ragged clouds, was a glaring red star. It hung exactly over the circle's holiest stone, glittering away like the sparkle in the eye socket of death. It was sullen and awful, and Rincewind couldn't help noticing just a little bit bigger than it was last night. A cry of horror went up from the assembled priests. The crowd on the surrounding banks pressed forward. This looked quite promising. Rincewind felt a knife handle slip into his hand, and the squelchy voice behind him said, "You ever done this sort of thing before?"
"What sort of thing?"
"Rushed into a temple, killed the priests, stolen the gold, and rescued the girl."
"No, not in so many words."
"You do it like this."
2 inches from Rincewind's left ear, a voice broke into a sound like a baboon with its foot trapped in an echo canyon, and a small but wiry shape rushed past him. By the light of the torches, he saw that it was a very old man, the skinny variety that generally gets called spry, with a totally bald head, a beard almost down to his knees, and a pair of matchstick legs on which varicose veins had traced the street map of quite a large city. Despite the snow, he wore nothing more than a studded leather holdall and a pair of boots that could have easily accommodated a second pair of feet. The 2 druids closest to him exchanged glasses and hefted their sickles. There was a brief blur, and they collapsed into tight balls of agony, making rattling noises. In the excitement that followed, Rincewind sidled along towards the altar stone, holding his knife gingerly so as not to attract any unwelcome comment. In fact, no one was paying a great deal of attention to him. The druids that hadn't fled the circle, generally the younger and more muscular ones, had congregated around the old man in order to discuss the whole subject of sacrilege, as it pertained to stone circles. But judging by the cackling and the sounds of gristle, he was carrying the debate. Twoflower was watching the fight with interest. Rincewind grabbed him by the shoulder. "Let's go," he said. "Shouldn't we help?" "I'm sure we'd only get in the way," said Rincewind hurriedly. "You know what it's like to have people looking over your shoulder when you're busy." "At least we must rescue the young lady," said Twoflower firmly. "All right, but get a move on." Twoflower took the knife and hurried up to the altar stone. After several inept slashes, he managed to cut the ropes that bound the girl, who sat up and burst into tears. "It's all right," he began. "It bloody well isn't," she snapped, glaring at him through 2 red-rimmed eyes. "Why do people always go and spoil things?" She blew her nose resentfully on the edge of her robe. Twoflower looked up at Rincewind in embarrassment. I don't think you quite understand," he said. "I mean, we just saved you from an absolutely certain death." "It's not easy round here," she said. "I mean, keeping yourself." She blushed and twisted the hem of her robe wretchedly. "I mean, staying, not letting yourself be, not losing your qualifications." "Qualifications?" said Twoflower, earning the Rincewind cup for the slowest person on the uptake in the entire multiverse. The girl's eyes narrowed. "I could have been up there with the moon goddess by now, drinking mead out of a silver bowl," she said petulantly. 8 years of staying home on Saturday nights right down the drain." She looked up at Rincewind and scowled. Then he sensed something. Perhaps it was a barely heard footstep behind him, perhaps it was a movement reflected in her eyes, but he ducked. Something whistled through the air where his neck had been and glanced off Twoflower's bald head. Rincewind spun round to see the arch-druid readying his sickle for another swing, and in the absence of any hope of running away, lashed out desperately with a foot. It caught the druid squarely on the kneecap. As the man screamed and dropped his weapon, there was a nasty little fleshy sound, and he fell forward. Behind him, the little man with the long beard pulled his sword from the body, wiped it with a handful of snow, and said, "My lumbago is giving me jip. You can carry the treasure." "Treasure?" said Rincewind weakly. "All the necklaces and stuff, all the gold collars. They've got lots of them. That's priests for you," said the old man wetly. "Nothing but talk, talk, talk. Who's the girl?" "She won't let us rescue her," said Rincewind. The girl looked at the old man defiantly through her smudged eyeshadow. "Bugger that," he said, and with one movement picked her up, staggered a little, screamed at his arthritis, and fell over. After a moment he said from his prone position, "Don't just stand there, you daft bitch! Help me up!" Much to Rincewind